Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, here we are, Friday, the 4th day of March in 2022, and a lot to talk about. And, needless to say, it's hard to believe that we have knocked COVID off the headlines with everything that's going on in Ukraine and the implications of that in terms of standing up our economy. That, I think, is going to be sort of a backdrop, an unintended or an unexpected backdrop against what happens here in this province, particularly as we head into an election. So we'll touch on that and other things. This is On the Ledge. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast. Dave Trafford here with you and our usual suspects, Keith Leslie, Sabrina Nanji, and John Wright in the chairs. And we're happy to welcome in the Mayor of Barrie, Jeff Lehman. Welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we talked about this last week when you made the announcement that you would not be seeking re-election as mayor in Barrie. That, in fact, you were seeking the Liberal nomination for Barrie-Springwater-Oro-Medonte. Who named that riding?
Yeah, it doesn't fit on the back of a hockey jersey, I'll tell you that
No
much.
kidding. So let's get into it. And I think that all of our collective question right off the bat was this one of these things where the Liberals came knocking? Was it something that you had kind of just decided that this is a natural evolution for your politics in Barrie?
Yeah, I do think it's a bit of a natural evolution. I had this huge, great honor of being mayor for the last 12 years. But for the last year, I've chaired Ontario's Big City Mayors Caucus. And what that's meant is I've worked with the mayors of the 29 largest cities across Ontario. And the more I did that work, the more I really realized the commonality of issues across our communities. And some of the approaches I think that we've been taking together speak to a more pragmatic, maybe a broader vision for government. And I want to be part of that. I think right now is a great opportunity for us to sort of build up as the Ontario Liberal Party and offer a real alternative to the current government. But on a personal level, there's never the right time to go. You're never going to feel like you've accomplished everything. But we brought a lot of big issues to resolution in the last year of this term of Barrie City Council. And we did a lot of things I think are relevant to a broader stage in the province of Ontario.
When we look at the landscape, though, I mean, clearly you've done well and you're a popular mayor, no doubt, in Barrie, but you're taking on a formidable incumbent in that riding.
Sure.
What makes you confident that you can unseat the Attorney General?
Well, I think the Attorney General, he's a good guy. I've talked, we've had a working relationship through COVID. I think he's done some good things as Attorney General, but not a lot for the riding. And, it's my feeling that there's a really stark choice coming in June. And that's between populist government and pragmatic government. And who's more pragmatic than mayors? I mean, we deal in the everyday. We deal in trying to get things accomplished at a community level. I believe that's what Stephen Del Duca believes in, and I believe that's what this province needs. And, the short answer to your question is we're going to go door to door to door. Coming out of COVID, it's a little bit different in terms of how a campaign looks. But, I've fought tough campaigns before. We're going to fight a hard one here.
Okay, I'm going to throw it out to the rest of the group here, but it's interesting that you should say that in terms of lining it up pragmatic and populist, because I heard a scrum with the Premier this past week, and he was asked a particular question. I don't remember the specifics of the question, but I do remember him saying, I don't want to get into a political stripe discussion about this. We want to do what is right for the people of Ontario. And Sabrina, I saw yesterday you had did some analysis with the folks at Sussex Strategy Group, and it was interesting to see how some of that language was percolating in the research that you guys were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can kind of expect some more from this so-called populist playbook from the Ford government coming up. We've got the budget expected late April now, going to give the PCs a chance to run on, all the goodies, the vote grabbing goodies that we're expecting in there. The House Leader, Paul Calandra, pretty much all but confirmed this week that we are going to get some tax cuts in there. Pocketbook issues are going to be top of mind. But I think it's kind of interesting how this is going to play out with the electorate. Like, we had Green leader Mike Schreiner this week make a big splashy platform promise about mental health. And he's saying that basically the cash that the Ford government is spending, or I guess to refund license plate renewal fees. So that will give about $120 back to drivers in Southern Ontario. Or, just you won't have to pay them again in the future. That's over a $1 billion hit to the provincial treasury annually. And Mike Schreiner is like, no, I'm not on board with that. If I become premier, he's the only MPP there. So a big ambitious promise there, but he's saying that he's going to put that money towards mental health. And he kind of acknowledged some of the pandemic anxiety that people are still feeling, and I think will still be feeling for time to come. So I think, you can expect some of these populist promises from the PCs. I think more of that, but I don't know if it's enough to woo the electorate. I mean, $120. I mean, what does that even really get you these days? It's like not really much at the
We did the calculation. 33 cents a day. Last week it was 33 cents a day.
But the Liberals are promising $2,750 in rebate checks that are going to come if they get elected. So is it a matter of checks? I thought Green leader Mike Schreiner's move was brilliant to say not only is it the first mental health policy that anyone's ever really introduced in this province, here's how I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to bring back those license fees, renewal fees that you never really missed. The legislation just passed this week. That was, I thought, here's a plan and here's how I'm going to pay for it. That's what people want to see. The fact that this government has stalled out on the $10 a day daycare, I mean, the suspicion is they're going to try and ink a deal in the next 2 months before the campaign actually starts. But if they don't, I mean, it's wise of the Liberals to jump in on this. But to offer those rebate checks struck me as a very cynical move in that, both are cutting checks for the voters. So, I know you guys don't think that 33 cents a day is much, but I think that $120, or as Premier Ford keeps pointing out, because he's got that two-car family mentality, it's $240 for a lot of families. It does count. And here we've got the Liberals promising 10 times that amount. So, I think it's part of the jaded thing, but it addresses the point that Sabrina made. Pocketbook issues. That's where we're going. Ford Nation is not ideological. They're smart. They're going to pick those issues that they think people are going to remember, and it's going to, make a difference for them. That's what they're going to do. And I think the license fee speaks to that, but I think Green leader Mike Schreiner tagged on the right approach. Here's something that really needs doing, and we all know it needs doing, and here's how I'm going to pay for it.
If I could just quickly finish up on Keith's point, I thought it was like a really smart move of the Liberals too, to kind of just frame it, how Keith said, like about the childcare deal that we haven't seen yet from the Ford government. So I think, a lot of this affordability stuff is about complicated policy, and, voters tend to tune out at that time. Like, we're going to get some complicated stuff on addressing housing affordability, electricity prices, that type of thing. So people vote like it's a visceral thing. When people vote, it's not just like, in the weeds policy talk. So it's going to be up to the parties to kind of spell that out for voters, I think. And just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, John, when we talk, you often bring up, the recovery is one thing, the reckoning is the other. And I think we're going to see a collision of these two things in the course of this campaign, because as much and all as there's, the practical side or the populist side, I don't think I see a lot of distinction between those two, for one thing. But the other side of it is, I think that, you're going to have the nurses quite concerned about their pay cap and all those sorts of things. This is going to be a very personal election campaign where there's going to be a lot of people who are going to have access to grind in a very specific way. And I just wonder whether or not any one of these parties is going to be able to keep those fires down, as opposed to, because if one of them catches and rages, that could dictate how and where this election plays out.
Well, the only thing I'd say is that I don't think there's been a campaign that I've seen recently where the parties identify what the issues are months in advance, and it ends up being the ballot question. Who would have thought we'd be into a war? I mean, even a month ago, and we would see 20 cents a liter tick up at the pumps because of that happening. Like who would have identified some of the costs that were coming down the pike, even a week or so ago. So I guess I go back to this and sort of say, remember buck a beer? Okay, well, nobody really does, except it was a big thing at the time. Leading into this election, what have we got? We got a budget that's coming up, and you're right, Keith, it may be that we've got an inked deal in that budget or shortly thereafter that they want to bring into the campaign and on daycare. But I find a lot of this right now is kind of shadow boxing. Like, I don't think it's going to be the issue that we end up in the campaign. Just think of, we're talking about something in June as opposed to something that's imminent. So I'm not really sure where that's going to be. I don't even know where the cost of living is going to be at that time. But here's what I do know, and that is that the Liberals have to get some traction. They're obviously looking at local candidates such as Mayor Lehman, because that's going to appeal right in the backyard of a voter, and it's going to be somebody who they already know, and it's going to be a team Liberal approach as opposed to a Del Duca election. So I think it's going to be very personality driven. At the moment, I don't see the issue as being very prominent at all. I just don't know what it's going to be, Dave.
Okay, so let's ask the candidate then. In that case, is this going to be a fight that's really focused locally, or is it going to be something where there's an overarching theme behind it, where we're going to say this is the issue that we're all going to have to pull together to deal with?
Sure. Well, I think we're going to anticipate pocketbook issues, of course, are going to be part of the conversation. But you're right. Like, a week's a lifetime in politics. We may not have seen the ballot question yet. I think when I look at my community, I look at the kind of things that people are talking about when I'm sitting in a coffee shop. It is pocketbook issues right now, and it's fear. We're coming out of a time of a global pandemic. We're in a time of tremendous global uncertainty. People want to know that there's a plan, and that the people who are in charge know what they're doing, and they're concerned for what everyday, people are concerned about. So here's the thing on the childcare thing, and I really feel very strongly about this. This is one of the reasons I'm running. So childcare is a major barrier to the labor market, right? We're in a time in the province of Ontario where we've got shortages of labor. We've got people who are unable to work. And the high cost of daycare is actually a significant contributing factor to that. I talk to families, people who have that choice. It's a very real, stark choice. I can work or I can stay home and take care of the kids. And I'm no better off either way because of the cost of childcare. And I think that's a pressing issue, especially in a province where we've got so many young families and we've got problems in the labor market. So that's why it's good policy. Sure, there's a pocketbook piece to this, and I think it's a critical issue. And I do think some of the election is going to be focused on pocketbook issues, but it's also good policy, and it addresses a critical need that's in the province today.
Dave, if I could jump in, we touched briefly, Sabrina touched briefly on the budget that's coming. We didn't mention the FAO's report, the Financial Accountability Officer, that this government has underspent so far in this fiscal year by $5.5 billion. Now the government disputes the accounting and whatnot and says they're doing it. But the bottom line is there's a heck of a deep war chest here for them for this election. And as Sabrina talked about tax cuts, some things they're going to have a lot of money to play with here, our money, but they're going to have a lot of it to use for this campaign. They didn't even have a platform in 2018, as we recall. Now this one, they probably aren't again. They're just going to run on the budget, which they've already made pretty clear, but especially by setting the date when they have. They've got the money to play for this, but will they be held accountable for things like, for example, starting Monday, the Ontario Autism Coalition is going to launch a big campaign going at this government. The waiting list for kids for autism services now 53,000, and they underspend. They promised $600 million this year on autism and spent $330 million right off the bat. So there's a huge target there. You mentioned the nurses are going to come after them. Everyone in the healthcare sector held by this 1% pay raise legislation. They're going to come after them as well. The Ford government has a lot of its record. We don't know what the election issues are going to be, obviously, at this point. But we can't forget about what we saw in the first waves of COVID and long-term care as well. I think people are going to bring those back, not just the opposition parties, people in coffee shops. People talk, oh, yes, people lost a lot of family members. Way too many staff members got sick, and the government ignored them in the first wave. So all these things, I think, are going to play out in the election. But to define what's going to be, the actual ballot question on that day, that maybe we'll know a month ahead of time, but probably not even then.
You talk about the budget and the effects of COVID, et cetera. I'm just guessing here, but my assumption is that none of what was spent in healthcare was in the hospital budgets in 2020 or 2021. So they're all in this place, and Sabrina, you may know better than any of us here. They're all in a place where they're facing these huge deficits, and just like a municipality, you can't run a deficit. That's a short-term, and it's a big problem that's going to have to be addressed, no matter who's in government in come June.
Yeah, I think that, we've seen a huge shift in the Ford government. Obviously, the pandemic has blown out of the water all these plans to balance the budget. And I don't think there's that much appetite for austerity measures right now. I mean, obviously, the Ford government, the premier came to power, promising to cut the gravy, if I can put it that way. And now, there's record spending happening. But I think that people are okay with that. They know the pandemic obviously cost money. We need to be putting even more into healthcare. Obviously, hospitals are wanting to make all this extra pandemic funding permanent. And we can't really ignore the surgery backlog. It's not so much about just, building beds. It's about staffing those beds too. So these parties are going to have to get a bit creative. But like I said, I don't know what that's going to mean for the average voter, because this policy stuff can get a bit complicated. The public tends to tune out on that. But I think, if you're a person who's waiting, for, cancer diagnosis, knee surgery, that type of thing, obviously you're going to cast your ballot for the party that has the best solution to that. I think there's a lot of burnout. And you're right, the healthcare workers, they've been rallying hard against the Ford government. So I think everyone's going to have some, way to get us out of this. And it's not just about popular tax cuts, buck a beer. I think that the public, even folks that I've been talking to who would never vote for Doug Ford, they're thinking about doing it now. They're pretty forgiving. They're he did the best he could during the pandemic. And so it's really going to be up to the opposition parties who have been having trouble getting their message out, because of course no one wants to hear, or everybody wants to hear from the powers that be, the people who are making the decisions in a pandemic. But it's going to be up to the opposition parties to remind people, just before the pandemic, we were talking about this debacle with license plates that. That seems like a whole other lifetime to me now. So I think, it's not so much to remind people about the handling of COVID, but also what comes next. How are we going to recover not only the economy, but also, shore up our healthcare system, our long-term care systems, so that, we're not dealing with this again. And it's just, politically speaking, very interesting timing, because the Ford government has now lost two high-profile ministers, Rod Phillips, who was most recently in charge of long-term care, and Christine Elliott, who says she's not going to run again and has been in charge of the health file and will keep it. But I think that to have, a smart spokesperson speaking to these policies, the PCs will need that for sure. And there's an opportunity here for the opposition parties to kind of take them down a peg on that front.
Yeah, John, last night you had sent out the breaking news about Christine Elliott. We've talked a lot about her in this podcast over the last 2 years, and it wasn't speculation, to be clear. It was it would not be at all surprising if the health minister decided that she was not going to run again, given the circumstances, given the stress. And I again, I don't care what your political stripe is. She has committed extraordinary amount of her life and energy to public service, as did Jim Flaherty. I would hope that most people would acknowledge the work she's done, whether or not we want to be critical of the handling of specifics around COVID-19. She deserves a proper send-off.
Yeah, she does. And she's been involved tangentially or directly in politics for a very long time. I mean, the Elliott family itself Her mom, Isabel Elliott, ran George Ashe's campaign. That's how far back that legacy goes. I mean, so she's been in and around politics, and I wish her all the best. It was such a cheap crack coming from somebody that said this morning that I heard saying something like, well, so she won't be for loss of money, getting a high paying job in a healthcare place. It's kind of like the last thing I think she'd do. But it does speak to another issue that we have been talking about on this podcast. And that is, are there any others who are going to also leave the Ford cabinet before the next budget? I mean, there has to be a cutoff time. Rod Phillips, I think, was a bit of a surprise. This one is not so much, but I wonder whether or not there are any others that are going to go. And then it's a question of fashioning again this plank that goes into the budget and what it looks like. I'm curious again to go back to Jeff and ask him. I mean, when you look across the board at the municipalities and the kind of challenges that they have right now, is this not leverage for the municipalities themselves going into an election campaign to have their own agenda of the things that are necessary for, the local areas to come forward and to rejuvenate? Because I'm not sure I'm hearing that voice fully. Or are they mainly concerned that if they stand up and they put something before the government, that they are going to pay a price in some way for having done it leading into an election campaign? I'm just a bit fuzzy on where the municipalities are nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you there's a lot of frustration from that FAO report. I mean, how do you, commit to pandemic spending in the midst of the crisis of a generation, whatever we want to call it, and then underspend so dramatically? How do you tell nurses on the front lines that, okay, inflation's 5%, but you're held to 1%. And by the way, we're not even going to spend the money we said we would spend on the system. There's some of that at our level too, because we're often the poor cousins of our federation, right? And tasked with delivering so many of the things that people need every day, which are getting more expensive. I mean, and I think recovery from COVID will be one of the themes here. And going back to the point that was made earlier, sometimes it is less about the math and more about the message that math sends. So a license plate sticker, maybe it's less about the $120 and more about, well, that's irritating. I'm getting rid of something that irritates people, and I'm the guy who gets rid of things that irritates people. But we know that's a sideshow. And I think the more time goes on, the more cynical people get about those sorts of things. We at the municipal level, I mean, sure, mayors have banged the drum for infrastructure spending, for social service spending, and so on. Coming out of the pandemic, there are some very, very real issues that have got way worse during COVID. Look at homelessness in our communities. The solutions there are not populist type things. They are spending on things like supportive housing. They are spending on things like mental health and addictions. And people want to know that the government cares, to that point about the message, not the math. They want to know that the government cares about improving their community, that things are going to get better in their neighborhood and in their town.
But isn't it also a situation where the province has to sort of pick a lane here on some of this stuff? I mean, in as much as let's go for housing, for example. Yeah.
Good one.
A lot of the problems that we face with housing will be municipal zoning. And it's all done, each town, each city, each region has its own view of planning and how we're going to implement affordable housing, how we're going to deal with density issues. Isn't it time for the province to say, here is the bar, and this is how we are going to deal with zoning and density issues across the board, whether you're in Toronto or Sudbury?
Well, thanks for that, Dave. And you're not wrong in the sense that municipal zoning and processes can improve. But I would challenge that narrative. We're hearing a lot of noise around, it's city's fault. It's municipality's fault. That's a tiny portion of the cost of housing. The price of a house in my city's doubled during COVID. Rent is at an all-time high. And yet, if you look around my city, Barrie, this would be the same in many other Ontario cities. You're not going to find rental buildings that were built since the 1980s. They're all built in the 60s and 70s. They're all old buildings. Why is that? You know why that is? The federal and provincial governments changed the tax treatment of investment in rental housing, and it stopped. That's why we've only had condos for 40 years. It's an economic problem. It needs an economic solution. And, I fully expect the government will focus on hammering away at municipal red tape because it's easy to do. It's not going to solve the problem. Now, I've got the challenge that I've got to tell people that on their doorstep, and that's tough. That's politics in complete sentences rather than quick sound bites or things that you can maybe blame on someone else. It's not going to solve the problem. If we want to make housing affordable, we're going to need all three levels of government in our federation to pick their roles. The feds have the money. The province has the operating funding and some of the regulatory control, but we need to make local decisions. And do we need to get more housing built? 100%. There's alignment on that among three different levels of government right now, but these aren't easy answers.
Well, our friend Tim Hudak at the Ontario Real Estate Association, former PC leader, will tell you that it's about supply. That in fact, the way we bring down the cost of housing is to increase supply. And he, quite frankly, will look at it and say, this is a regulatory issue that we run into, and we got to get out of our own way on many of these things. For example, even at Toronto City Hall, the idea of allowing for rooming houses. And I realize that in and of itself has this whole stigma attached to it and history behind it. But if you take the concept and the ability to be able to carve up the real estate or the housing space that really is not being used, I can tell you in our house, we're overhoused just by virtue of the kids moving out already. So we need to be more flexible, we need to be more nimble, and we need to accelerate this more than anything. It's great that everybody's on the same page in terms of needing housing, but there's a lot of talking going on here.
Yeah, so in Barrie last year, we doubled the number of housing starts over the year before. We went from 600 in 2020 to 1,200 in 2021. And you know how we did that? It's like the unicorn of housing, the missing middle. Right. And there's a reason why that is the solution. It's because people who are overhoused can't find somewhere else that they really genuinely want to live in. So they, in many cases, will stay where they are. And entry level folks, people also who want to rent a home, rent something, can't find it. That missing middle happened here in no small part because we did open up more land. We did open up zoning permissions, and we saw the market respond. Look, there are local answers to this, but you can't take a problem where the price of housing is doubled and say, getting approvals a few months sooner is going to fix the problem. It might be part of the solution, but there needs to be more dramatic action. And to your point around supply and demand, the Housing Task Force, there's some good recommendations in there on supply. I think we all agree that we need to get more supply built, but that's half the equation. And it's not the supply shortage that doubled the price of housing in the last 2 years. It is demand factors. They're short-term factors. And unless we get serious about using the economic levers of government to make housing more affordable for people, we're not going to make a difference for many years.
Just on that, I'll let everybody jump in on this because I think that the focus on rental might be, and I realize why we talk about it, but home ownership really is the stability of in a community. It's actually the number one tool at eliminating poverty. If we can have people own their homes, it means that it's better for their health, their education. There's all kinds of research that shows this. We need that kind of strategy at a provincial level. I realize we've got the national housing strategy, but specifically here in Ontario, to ensure home ownership, and I don't see that in any peripheral vision right now.
I don't think there's anybody that's willing to guarantee home ownership as part of the Canadian dream going forward. Certainly not in the big cities. It's just not realistic at this point for someone who's, say, under the age, 35, 40, of getting together that kind of a down payment or to get into the housing market, unless they're inheriting, unless they're have family helping them out. Not everybody has that. So how do you address that? I'm not sure it can be addressed with these regulatory changes. It's going to take something from the province. It's going to take something from the feds. But I think when the mayor spoke about the missing middle, that in itself, that's something that the province can, set as a standard everywhere. We will allow up to 3 stories or 4 stories in every neighborhood, in every community, so that we can get the housing. And these will be split-level townhomes or whatever, where we can get young people in
Exactly.
Affordable homes. Taking the average price of a detached home in Toronto is now over $2 million. Taking that down to $1 million isn't going to help most people under the age of 40 get into the housing market. Even if we could somehow magically get that number down by 50%, which I don't see that happening. So there are ways, and this missing middle seems to be, the policymakers all know about this. It has to be able to get there, and it's going to take a provincial mandate or a federal mandate to allow this sort of thing to get through, I think. That's my take on the housing issue, and I am no expert on it by any stretch. But I lived in Cabbagetown for 26 years. When we moved in, it was full of rooming houses, and we paid $250,000 for that house. And 25 years later, it was $1.5 million, and the rooming houses are all gone.
But the biggest problem that we have is actually the labor market, where young people, in fact, are not going to be able to live in a city that we need serviced by young people. I mean, that's simply the point. And I'm not landing on a particular issue today because I'm not sure what the issue is. I look at the polling and I find a couple of things that are really disturbing. When I looked at all the polling that we did on the truckers protest, there is about 45% of the people in this country who had their anger with the truckers. And I mean, they were with them. And how they were doing what they were doing. So the majority, in fact, 60% were against the truckers and how they handle it. But then you start looking down into, the anger of the people who are with the truckers and how they were going about doing that. And they're primarily young people. They're disaffected, disconnected people who have this real anger at people like us. I mean, here we are. We're homeowners. We're in good positions in our life. We've got money coming in. If anything, I'm a boomer sitting in my home, and I'm a bad person now because I'm sitting in my home and I'm not opening it up. But there's another group of people in our society who are aged 18 to 34 who are completely out of the housing market, who have great difficulty in holding the kind of jobs that they want to have, that don't see a future materializing in the same way that they want. That we've been able to. And I wonder how that's going to show up in the next election campaign. Because, but Dave, I was just going to say that a politician who we all know, who may even be listening to this podcast, was putting forward a private member's bill the other day that was going to do away with the interest on student loans. And I kind of looked at it and thought, wouldn't you put together a private member's bill that does away with student loan altogether? I mean, the interest is, how can you, as a student, who's in their mid-20s now, be carrying maybe, $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 worth of debt and expect to go somewhere, for a down payment in a house or to get further ahead? And what you get are these snarky comments back that usually say, well, before I was a lawyer, I had to, rack up debt too. And it's kind of like, no. We're talking about young people who are dental assistants, who are at that low rung, who are going to be working at $25 an hour, who are never going to pay that off. I'm not talking about somebody who's being able to get into the workforce and earn a lot of money. Well, I guess what I'm saying is that, again, I go right back to this. I'm not sure that the issues that we're talking about are going to be the issues in a campaign. We're coming out of COVID, which seems rapid at the moment, and to what we've said on the podcast before, there is going to be a reckoning. And I'm not sure what that's going to be. But when I look into the numbers and I see this very angry group of people, I don't hear their voice at the moment. And I don't know whether or not one of the political parties will be able to channel that. But I know it's out there. And I just don't think it's shown up yet.
Well, Sabrina, if you listen to the ads I'm hearing on the radio and some of them on the TV, Ontario is back, and it's probably the best place on the planet to be.
Yeah, if you're paying attention to this blitz of advertising, I mean, I've been catching it on the radio, on TV, but these aren't technically partisan ads, which might surprise you. They're paid for by the government of Ontario, the PC Ford government. And I'm sure I'm not the only reporter that's filed a Freedom of Information request to get the numbers on this. We'll see if that comes back before the Auditor General can maybe dig into it. But expect to see a lot of advertising about how we're the best ever in the entire planet universe. And I don't know if, that reality is actually being reflected on the ground. obviously, you know, the Conservatives want to play up that narrative, you know, make everyone feel positive we're coming out of the pandemic. But just a quick side note on government advertising. I mean, the Conservatives are not the only ones to do this type of thing before an election time, you know, pump a lot of money into government advertising. It was actually the Liberals, the previous Liberal government, that kind of removed the Auditor General's oversight of government advertising. You know, she said in the past, Bonnie Lysyk, the AG, that there's a lot of ads, Liberal and Conservatives, that she wouldn't have approved if she still had her old oversight powers, and that basically she kind of screens ads for being too partisan. The PC's promised to restore that oversight. They haven't done it yet. Time is ticking in this mandate. It doesn't seem like it's going to come through, but it's interesting because, and actually I'd be kind of curious maybe if Jeff had any thoughts on this, but we haven't seen much advertising from the Liberal Party yet. And we saw a big run from the NDP and the PCs taking aim at Stephen Del Duca, and he kind of seems like the man to beat right now. He's got a lot of political baggage, and I think John would know this as well, that it really matters to define your opponent. And right now, I think it's the time is ticking for the Liberals to start running ads, you know, telling us more about who Stephen Del Duca is. A lot of folks don't really know him, and those who do know that he tried to bypass local rules for a backyard pool, you know, that he put GO stations in his riding where, you know, experts and the experts that the province had said, you know, GO stations shouldn't go here. So a lot of political baggage, but expect a lot of positive stuff coming from the PCs. Like, they've been pumping themselves up as the party that says yes, the party that builds things, you know, building highways, building infrastructure. That sounds good to the electorate. I guess we'll have to see if it actually has an impact at the polls.
Well, Mayor Lehman, I thought it was rich that Kathleen Wynne was the one who was complaining about these ads.
Well, I mean, I think every government has advertised its progress. It is fair to say. Are people buying it? And I mean, you ask, okay, we haven't seen much from the Liberals. I think you're gonna. We are 3 months away, and as John says, there's been a few other things in the news, but I would say that you're gonna hear a lot about who Stephen Del Duca is and what our vision is for the province. I do think that there's an unprecedented level of cynicism right now. I think John is right to point to the anger that we see from young people. Look, voting is an emotional act. Whether you're talking about a local election where you're voting purely based on the personality of your councillor or your mayor candidate, or how the parties of the day make you feel, the leaders of the day make you feel. And I think we're just getting started here. You know, I've come to know Stephen Del Duca. I believe he believes in good policy, and I believe he is a stark alternative to Doug Ford. I think the feelings around Doug Ford are not going to be moved by ads or new slogans which attempt to run contrary to a narrative that everybody really does feel in their bones about this government. And yeah, it's up to us now to offer the alternative. No way around that. We need to get our leader better known. We need to get our policies better known. We need to show people that we are ready to govern and govern quite differently than this government. And that ultimately will be presented through the course of a campaign. All
right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Jeff Lehman, Mayor of Barrie, thanks for taking time. I know you've got a hard stop here, so we won't keep you too much longer, but we appreciate your jumping in on the show this morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Great conversation, guys.
Keith Leslie, John Wright, Sabrina Nanji. You should subscribe to her newsletter, by the way, Queen's Park Observer. That's how you can sound smart about what goes on at Queen's Park. So there you go. Subscribe, and you stay up to date. She's in your inbox every morning. So it's a busy thing to do. All right, that'll do it. This is On the Ledge. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. It is produced for Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.